What would you do if the mother who raised you confessed she never loved you, blaming you for a death you couldn't stop? In a rain-soaked house, surrounded by shattered glass and a knife pressed to her throat, Emma Grayson faces a truth that rips her world apart. Her family sold her father's legacy to save a brother who despises her. Was it all a lie hidden in a heart-shaped locket, or a betrayal buried deeper than the grave? Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers to uncover the echoes of this forgotten soul. What would you do if the mother who raised you confessed she never loved you, blaming you for a death you couldn't stop? In a rain-soaked house, surrounded by shattered glass and a knife pressed to her throat, Emma Grayson faces a truth that rips her world apart. Her family sold her father's legacy to save a brother who despises her. Was it all a lie hidden in a heart-shaped locket, or a betrayal buried deeper than the grave? That story begins here, in a small West Virginia town, on a Sunday morning drenched in syrup and sorrow. Hit that subscribe button and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers to uncover the echoes of this forgotten soul. The kitchen smelled of warm butter and maple syrup, a scent that still haunts Emma Grayson 30 years later. She was 6, perched on a wobbly stool, her tiny fingers clutching a stuffed bunny as her father flipped pancakes on the griddle. He was a wiry man with a crooked grin, his apron dusted with flour, shaping the batter into goofy faces, eyes made of blueberries, a bacon strip mouth. "Princess, come help your old man flip these masterpieces," he called, waving his spatula like a conductor's baton. Emma giggled, sliding off the stool, her bunny tumbling to the floor as she raced to his side. Then it happened. The spatula clattered to the linoleum, a sharp, metallic clang that echoed in her skull. Her father clutched his chest, his face twisting into something she didn't recognize. Pain, fear, a silent scream. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling as he crumpled to his knees, then to the floor. She stood frozen, the pancake sizzling black on the griddle, smoke curling up like a ghost. Her mother, Margaret, burst in, her apron strings flapping as she dropped to his side, shaking him, screaming his name. But he was gone. A heart attack, the doctor said later. Just like that, the man who called her princess vanished, leaving behind a house too big, too quiet, and a locket Emma would find days later. She discovered it in the garage, tucked inside a wooden box under a pile of oily rags. The heart-shaped pendant gleamed silver, its surface etched with "Princess of Mine" in her father's jagged scrawl. Inside was a faded photo of her at 3, grinning in his arms. Emma clutched it to her chest, a secret treasure she never showed her mother. Margaret was too busy grieving, curled on the couch with a bottle of cheap wine, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. Emma learned to tiptoe around her, to swallow her own tears, because even at 6, she knew her mother's pain was a wall she couldn't climb. 3 years passed in a blur of silence and small-town whispers. Then Henry Grayson walked into their lives. He was a carpenter with calloused hands and a gentle smile. Met Margaret at a widow's support group in town. Emma liked him. He smelled of sawdust and told bad jokes that made her laugh despite herself. Within a year, they married, and Henry moved into their creaky old house on Maple Street. For a while, it felt like the shadows lifted. Henry fixed the leaky roof, built Emma a bookshelf, and taught her how to sand wood in his workshop out back. "You've got steady hands, kiddo," he'd say, ruffling her hair. She dared to hope they could be a family again. Then Dylan was born. Emma was 9, peering through the hospital room door as Margaret cradled her new baby brother, her face glowing in a way Emma hadn't seen since before the pancakes burned. "He's perfect," Margaret whispered, stroking Dylan's tiny fist. Emma waited for her mother to call her over, to share that glow, but Margaret's eyes never left the bundle in her arms. Henry squeezed Emma's shoulder, murmuring, "You're a big sister now, Em, that's special too." But it didn't feel special. It felt like the start of something slipping away. The change crept in slow, like damp rot in the floorboards. Margaret quit her job at the diner to stay home with Dylan, cooing over his every gurgle while Emma's lunches went unpacked, her school projects unnoticed. "Dylan needs me," Margaret would say, brushing off Henry's frowns. These early years are crucial. Emma wanted to scream, "What about my early years?" But the words stuck in her throat, heavy as the locket she now wore under her shirt. She caught Henry watching her sometimes, his brow furrowed as Margaret fussed over Dylan at dinner, leaving Emma to eat alone with a plate of cold mac and cheese. One night when Emma was 10, the tension snapped. She'd spent an hour on a science project, a model volcano with real fizzing lava, hoping Margaret would notice. Instead, her mother was spoon-feeding Dylan mashed peas, ignoring the volcano on the table. "Mom, look what I made," Emma said, her voice small but desperate. Margaret waved her off. "Not now, Emma." Dylan's fussy. Defeated, Emma trudged upstairs to Dylan's room, strewn with toys and dirty socks, and started picking up, a chore Margaret had silently assigned her. She was halfway through when Henry found her. "You don't have to do that, Emma," he said, kneeling beside her. "He's old enough to clean his own mess." Emma shrugged, her hands trembling. "Mom says I'm helping." Henry's jaw tightened, and he stood, storming to the kitchen. Emma crept to the stairs, listening as his voice rose. "Margaret, she's not his maid. And what's this about Dylan being all that matters? I'm not even sure—" He stopped, but Emma caught the edge in his tone. Margaret's reply was sharp, venomous. "Don't you dare question my son. You think you know everything, Henry? Get out if you don't like it." The back door slammed, and Emma peeked out to see Henry pacing the yard in the dark, hands in his hair. Later, he came back inside, his face weary. He sat Emma down in the workshop, sanding a plank as he spoke softly. "Sometimes people get lost in their own pain, kiddo. Doesn't mean they don't love you. I'm here, okay?" She nodded, clutching the locket, but a seed of doubt sprouted. What did Henry mean about Dylan? Was there a secret her mother was hiding? The next day, Margaret acted like nothing happened, but Emma saw the crack in their family widen, a crack that would soon swallow her whole. The air in the Grayson house grew thicker as the years piled on, a quiet rot seeping into the walls of their West Virginia home. Emma was 18 now, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her hands steady from years of sanding wood with Henry. She'd earned a scholarship to Marshall University, dreaming of a life beyond Maple Street's peeling paint and her mother's cold silences. But just as she packed her bags, the ground shifted beneath her again. Dylan, her 14-year-old brother, had cracked open Henry's safe and stolen $3,000. The money, scraped together from Henry's carpentry jobs, was meant for emergencies, not the gaming rig Dylan now hunched over in his room, its neon lights casting a sickly glow on his smug face. Emma found out when Henry stormed into the kitchen, his voice a low rumble she'd never heard before. "Margaret, he broke into the safe, $3,000 gone!" Margaret stood at the sink, her shoulders stiff, scrubbing a pot like it could erase the truth. "He's just a boy, Henry," she snapped, not turning around. "Boys make mistakes. You're too hard on him." Emma hovered in the doorway, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, watching Henry's hands clench into fists. "Too hard? He stole from us. From Emma's future." Margaret whirled, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare blame my son. You've always favored her. Always." The fight spilled into the night, a storm of shouts and slammed doors. Emma retreated to her room, the locket around her neck cold against her skin. She could still hear them through the thin walls, Henry's voice breaking as he said, "I've given everything to this family, Maggie, but I'm starting to wonder if Dylan's even—" He cut off, and Margaret's scream sliced through the air. "Get out! Get out if you think that!" Emma pressed her ear to the wall, her heart pounding. Even what, she wondered? Was Henry doubting Dylan was his son? The thought gnawed at her, a splinter she couldn't pull out. The next morning, Henry was back, his eyes shadowed but his resolve firm. He called Emma to the workshop, where sawdust danced in the sunlight, streaming through cracked windows. "You're going to college, Em," he said, pulling a stack of bills from his toolbox, his secret stash, untouched by Dylan's greed. "I've been saving for you. Marshall's yours." Emma's throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes as she hugged him. "Thank you," she whispered, the locket pressing into her chest like a heartbeat. But Margaret's shadow loomed. That night, Emma heard her mother's footsteps pacing the hall. Then a crash. A wooden table, one Emma and Henry had built together, splintered on the floor. She rushed downstairs, finding Margaret standing over the wreckage, her hands trembling. "If you go, Emma," Margaret hissed, "what happens to Dylan? He needs me. He needs us." Her voice cracked, but her eyes were hard, unyielding. Emma stared at the broken table, her hands shaking with a rage she'd never let out. "What about me, Mom? Didn't I need you?" Margaret's face twisted and she spat. "You were fine. Dylan's fragile. You don't understand." Emma turned away, tears burning her cheeks, the locket's weight a silent anchor as she climbed the stairs. Days later, sorting through old boxes for her move, Emma found something that stopped her cold. A yellowed hospital bill tucked in a dusty folder, dated a year before Dylan's birth. It listed a procedure, a termination, signed by Margaret Grayson. Her breath caught. Had her mother been pregnant before Dylan? And if so, why hide it? She remembered Henry's cut-off words, the doubt in his voice. Was Dylan a replacement for a child Margaret lost, or a lie she'd spun to keep Henry? Emma's mind raced, but she shoved the paper back, too afraid to ask. The final blow came the night before she left for Marshall. Margaret cornered Henry in the kitchen, her voice a venomous whisper. Emma caught from the stairs. "You're sending her off with my money? That's for Dylan's future." Henry's reply was steel. "It's my money, Maggie, and Emma's earned it. You can't keep punishing her for being strong." Margaret laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "Strong? She's selfish, always has been." Then came the crash. Margaret hurled a ceramic mug at the wall, shards skittering across the floor. "If she goes, don't expect me to welcome her back." Emma stood frozen, her duffel at her feet, the hospital bill burning a hole in her memory. Henry found her there, his face etched with exhaustion. "She's hurting, Em," he said, pulling her into a hug. "But you're not selfish. You're my girl." He handed her a bus ticket and a worn photo of them sanding wood together, a rare smile on his face. "Go make something of yourself. I'll handle things here." She nodded, clutching the ticket, but as she boarded the Greyhound the next day, the locket felt heavier than ever. What was her mother hiding? And why did Henry stay when he doubted everything? At Marshall, Emma threw herself into her studies. Engineering, a nod to Henry's craft. She called home sometimes, but Margaret's voice was always clipped, distracted by Dylan's latest tantrum. Henry's updates were weary. He's skipping school, hanging with rough kids. "I'd try, Em, but your mom..." He'd trail off, and Emma would grip the phone, picturing the safe's empty belly. She wondered if Dylan knew what he'd stolen, not just money, but the fragile thread holding their family together. Years later, she'd replay that summer in her mind, the hospital bill a ghost that wouldn't fade. Had her mother aborted a child her father wanted? Or was it Henry's, lost before Dylan came along? The truth dangled just out of reach, a puzzle piece she couldn't place. But one thing was clear. Dylan's theft had cracked more than a safe. It had shattered any illusion of trust Emma still clung to. The years at Marshall University carved Emma Grayson into someone new, someone who could sketch blueprints with the same steady hands Henry had once praised in his West Virginia workshop. By 27, she'd landed a job at a consulting firm in Huntington, her one-bedroom apartment a quiet refuge from the chaos of Maple Street. She sent $1,500 each month to her mother, Margaret, a lifeline she clung to despite the silence that often greeted her calls. Henry's voice was the only warmth on those rare check-ins, until one crisp October day in 2022, when it wasn't there at all. "Massive heart attack," Margaret said over the phone, her tone flat, mechanical. "He's gone, Emma." The line went dead before Emma could ask more, and the locket around her neck pulsed with a grief she hadn't felt since the pancakes burned. She drove back to Maple Street for the funeral, the house sagging under neglect, peeling paint, overgrown weeds, a shutter dangling like a broken wing. Margaret played the widow well, sobbing into a handkerchief as neighbors murmured condolences. But Emma saw the cracks. Her mother's eyes darting to Dylan, now 23, slouched in wrinkled jeans and a faded hoodie, scrolling his phone through the service. After, Emma found Margaret in the kitchen, counting condolence cash like it was a lifeline. Dylan's struggling, Margaret said, not meeting her gaze. He needs me now more than ever. Emma bit her tongue, the $1,500 deduction from her bank account a silent scream in her mind. Then came Vanessa Ness Carter. Dylan dragged her into the house a month later, a wiry girl with a raptor tattoo curling up her neck and a smirk that set Emma's nerves on edge. Ness sprawled on the couch like she owned it, chipped nail polish glinting as she cracked open one of Henry's old beers. "This dump's a step up from my last gig," she drawled, eyeing Emma with a lazy grin. Dylan just grunted. Already lost in his Xbox, Margaret beamed, oblivious. "She's good for him," she told Emma over the phone. "Keeps him home." Emma doubted that. Dylan's bloodshot eyes and the empty bottles piling up in the trash told a different story. The second layer of betrayal hit on a humid July afternoon in 2023. Emma pulled up to the house for a rare visit, groceries in hand to stock Margaret's bare fridge. She froze in the driveway. The spot where Henry's beat-up Chevy truck once sat was empty. That truck, with its dented fender and wood-scented cab, was his pride, the one he'd promised to fix up with Emma someday. She stormed inside, finding Ness rifling through a box of Henry's old papers in the workshop. "Where's the truck?" Emma demanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Ness looked up, smirking. "Sold it." "What's it to you? Old man's gone. Might as well cash in." Emma's blood ran cold. She turned to Margaret, who stood in the doorway twisting her hands. "Dylan needed money," Margaret mumbled, avoiding her eyes. "He's got debts, bad ones. I had to help him." Emma's voice trembled with fury. "That was Henry's, ours. You let them sell it?" Margaret's face hardened. "You don't live here, Emma. You don't get it." Ness laughed, a grating sound, and tossed a crumpled receipt at Emma's feet. $800 for the truck, a fraction of its worth. "Deal's done, princess," she sneered, echoing the nickname Emma's father once used. The locket burned against her chest as she shoved Ness back, papers scattering. "Get out of his stuff," she snapped, but Ness just sauntered off, unfazed. That night, Emma's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Give it back or you're next." Her stomach dropped. Give what back? The truck was gone. Unless Ness was after something else in Henry's papers. She remembered the hospital bill from years ago, the questions about Dylan's origins. Had Ness found something worth more than a truck? Emma drove home to Huntington, her mind racing, the threat looping like a siren. She called Margaret the next day, demanding answers. "Dylan's in with some rough people," Margaret admitted, her voice small. "Ness says they'll handle it." Handle it how? Emma wondered. The locket's weight a reminder of how much she'd already lost. Digging through her own memories, Emma pulled out a box of old letters she'd taken from Maple Street years ago. Among them was a life insurance policy, $50,000, paid out after her father's death, signed by Margaret. Emma's breath hitched. She'd been 6 when he died. No one told her about money. Had Margaret kept it all, funneling it into Dylan's endless needs? The policy listed Emma as a beneficiary, but the account was long closed. Her hands shook as she dialed Margaret again. "Did you get insurance money when Dad died?" she asked, voice tight. Silence stretched. Then Margaret's clipped reply, "That's none of your business." The line went dead, but the truth hung heavy. Her mother had buried more than her father that day. Emma kept sending the $1,500, though each transfer felt like a knife twist. Dylan's life spiraled, booze, late nights, Ness whispering in his ear, Margaret's excuses grew thinner. He's stressed, he's sensitive, Ness is helping. But Emma saw the workshop's empty shelves, the truck's ghost in the driveway. Henry's legacy, his tools, his truck, his love, was being sold off piece by piece to prop up a brother who barely acknowledged her. She visited less, the threats from that unknown number a shadow she couldn't shake. What did Ness want? Was it tied to the insurance? Or something Henry left behind? One night, staring at the locket's faded photo, Emma traced her father's face. Had he known about Margaret's secrets? The lost child, the money, the lies? Henry had stayed, despite his doubts, but Emma felt the ground crumbling beneath her. The family she'd fought to hold together was slipping away, and she wasn't sure she wanted to catch it anymore. The rain hammered Huntington like a fist, turning the streets into rivers as Emma Grayson gripped her steering wheel, her phone buzzing with Margaret's desperate call. "Emma, save me, they're here!" It was July 2025, 2 years since Henry's death, and Emma had kept her distance from Maple Street, the $1,500 monthly transfers her only tether to a family that felt more like a ghost. But that plea, raw panic pulled her back. She sped through the storm, the locket around her neck swinging like a pendulum, its weight a mix of dread and duty. What had Dylan done now? And who was they? She screeched to a stop outside the house, its warped siding glistening under the downpour. The front door hung ajar, swaying in the wind, and Emma's stomach twisted as she stepped inside. The living room was a war zone. Overturned chairs, shattered glass from a broken lamp, takeout boxes strewn like casualties. Margaret cowered in the corner, her gray hair wild, a fresh bruise blooming on her cheek. Dylan stood near the couch, his hoodie soaked, yelling at Vanessa Ness Carter, whose raptor tattoo gleamed under the flickering light. 2 men loomed in the shadows, burly, unshaven, one twirling a switchblade that caught the dim glow. "Pay up, kid," the man with the knife growled, his voice gravelly, "or this gets messy." Dylan's hands shook, his bravado gone. "I told you, I'll get it, just give me time." Ness smirked, arms crossed, unfazed. "He's good for it, Tony, chill." Emma's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and unsteady. "What the hell's going on?" All eyes snapped to her, and the second man, shorter with a scar across his lip, stepped forward. "Who's this? Another Grayson to bleed dry?" He lunged, grabbing her arm, but Emma twisted free, years of karate kicking in as she shoved him back. "Enough," she shouted, her pulse racing. "Someone tell me what's happening." Margaret whimpered. "Dylan owes them money, $5,000, they came for it." Emma's eyes darted to her brother, his pale face a mix of fear and defiance. "Gambling? Drugs? What is it this time?" Dylan spat. "None of your business, Emma. Just leave." But Tony, the knife man, wasn't playing. He grabbed Margaret by the hair, yanking her up as she screamed and pressed the blade to her throat. "Money now, or she's done." Emma's world tilted. She fumbled in her purse, pulling out $800, her emergency cash, and thrust it at Tony. "Take it and go." He snatched the bills, counting them with a sneer. "Not even close, princess." He shoved Margaret back, the knife still glinting, and nodded to Scar. "We'll be back tomorrow. Full amount, or blood." They vanished into the rain, leaving a silence heavier than the storm. Emma knelt by Margaret, her hands trembling as she touched the bruise. "Are you okay?" Margaret pulled away, her voice bitter. "If you'd sent more money, this wouldn't have happened." The words hit like a slap. Emma stood, rain dripping from her coat, and faced her mother. "More money? I've given you everything I can." Margaret's eyes narrowed, cold and unyielding. "Not enough." Dylan needed it. Emma's gaze shifted to Ness, who lit a cigarette with a smirk, then to Dylan, slumping on the couch. "What about the will?" she asked, remembering Ness's taunts from months ago. "You said it's all his now. Is that true?" Margaret straightened, her jaw tight. "Yes, everything's Dylan's. You don't deserve it." Emma's breath caught, the locket burning against her skin. "Why?" she whispered, voice breaking. Margaret's face twisted, a mask of rage and grief. "Because you let your father die. You stood there, 6 years old, and did nothing while he collapsed. I've carried that guilt, raised Dylan to make up for it. You're nothing to me, Emma." The room spun. Emma saw it again. The kitchen, the smoke, her father's crumpled form. She'd been a child, helpless, but Margaret's words carved a wound decades deep. Ness laughed, a harsh bark. "Told you, Dill, she's out of here." Dylan glared. "Good riddance. Go back to your perfect life." Tears streamed down Emma's face, mixing with the rain as she stumbled toward the door. "I tried," she choked out, "for Henry, for you, but I'm done." Margaret shouted after her. "You're selfish, just like always." Ness's cackle followed. and Dylan's silence was louder than both. Emma stepped into the storm, the locket's chain digging into her neck as thunder roared. She drove home in a daze, the knife's edge replaying in her mind not just Tony's but her mother's words, sharper and deadly. Back in Huntington, she sat on her couch, soaked and shivering, and pulled up her banking app. Her finger hovered over the $1,500 transfer, 2 years of sacrifice for a family that despised her. She hit cancel, a sob tearing free as the screen confirmed it. The locket fell into her palm, its photo blurred by her tears. Had her father known Margaret's heart could turn so cold? She remembered the hospital bill, the insurance money, secrets piling up like debt, and now this, a mother who blamed her for a tragedy she couldn't stop. Days later, Margaret's calls started, angry voicemails about the missing money. "You can't do this, Emma. Dylan needs it." Then Dylan's texts. "You're killing her, you bitch." Even Ness chimed in, a LinkedIn message of all things. "You'll pay for this." Emma blocked them all, but the knife's edge lingered. A threat not just from thugs, but from a family unraveling into something she didn't recognize. What had Margaret meant about making up for it? Was there more to her father's death than she'd been told? The rain didn't follow Emma Grayson back to Huntington, but the storm inside her raged on. It was August 2025, weeks since she'd canceled the $1,500 monthly transfers, severing the last thread to Maple Street after Margaret's knife-edged confession. Her one-bedroom apartment felt lighter without that weight, but the silence was deafening. No more voicemails, no more guilt trips. She threw herself into work, sketching blueprints late into the night, the locket around her neck a quiet companion. Yet the echoes of that night lingered, the blade at her mother's throat, the venom in Margaret's voice, blaming her for a death she couldn't prevent. Emma wondered if she'd ever outrun the shadow of that 6-year-old girl, frozen in a smoky kitchen. Margaret didn't let go quietly. The first week, her calls flooded Emma's phone, shrill demands about the money, pleas laced with accusations. "You're killing us, Emma. Dylan's lost without it." Then came Dylan's texts, sloppy with rage. "Mom's crying every night, you selfish bitch. Fix this." Emma's finger hovered over block, but Ness beat her to it with a LinkedIn message. Absurdly professional, yet dripping with venom. "You're breaking a fragile family. Dylan's too sensitive for this stress. Pay up or karma's coming." Emma laughed bitterly, blocking them all. Karma? She'd spent years paying for a crime she didn't commit. The harassment escalated when a letter arrived from a small-time lawyer in town, claiming Emma had abandoned her familial duties and owed back payments. Enclosed was a copy of Henry's will. Nothing for her, everything to Dylan, just as Margaret had bragged. But a second document stopped her cold. Her father's life insurance policy, $50,000 paid to Margaret in 1,998. Listing Emma as a co-beneficiary. The payout was gone, drained years ago, and Margaret had never mentioned it. Emma's hands shook as she dialed her Aunt Clara, Henry's sister, the only family she still trusted. "Did Mom get money when Dad died?" she asked, voice tight. Clara sighed. "Yeah, hun, a big chunk. She said it was for the kids, but I never saw you with new shoes." It all went to Dylan. The betrayal sank deep, a wound wider than Margaret's words. Emma stared at the locket, its photo of her and her father now a taunt. Had Margaret hoarded that money to erase her own guilt, pouring it into Dylan while Emma scraped by? She didn't confront her mother. Silence was her weapon now. But clarity came in an unexpected place. Sorting through old boxes one rainy afternoon, Emma found a metal tin tucked under college notebooks. Henry's handwriting on the lid. For M, inside was $10,000 in crisp bills and a letter, dated a month before his death. "Emma," it began, "you're my pride, my girl. I've saved this for you. Your dreams, your freedom. I'm sorry I couldn't shield you more from her pain. She's lost, but you're not. Live big, kiddo. Love, Henry." Tears spilled onto the page, blurring the ink as Emma clutched the tin. Henry had known Margaret's favoritism, known the family was fracturing, and he'd left her this lifeline. She sobbed, the locket warm against her chest, a bridge between two fathers who'd loved her when her mother couldn't. That night, she slept soundly for the first time in years, Henry's words a balm to her scars. 6 months passed, a quiet stretch of healing. Emma used Henry's gift and her savings to buy a small house on the edge of Huntington, a fixer-upper with a porch she'd sand herself, a nod to the workshop she'd lost. She hung the locket on a nail by her bed, its heart catching the morning light. Then, one crisp January day in 2026, her phone buzzed with a text from Dylan. "Mom's in the hospital, so no demands, no venom, just broken words." Emma stared at the screen, her heart a tangle of anger and pity. Was he finally waking up, or was this another trap? She drove to the hospital, a brick building on the outskirts of town, and parked across the street. Through a window, she saw Margaret Gaunt, hooked to an IV, her gray hair a tangled mess. Dylan sat beside her, head in his hands, no phone in sight. He looked older, thinner, like the weight of his choices had finally landed. Emma's chest tightened, memories of Henry's gentle hope, her father's goofy pancakes, clashing with Margaret's cruelty and Dylan's scorn. She didn't go in. Instead, she walked to the front desk, sliding a $500 envelope under the glass. "For Margaret Grayson's bill," she said, voice steady, no name. The clerk nodded and Emma left, the locket swaying as she stepped into the cold. Back home, she sat on her porch, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in hues of gold and ash. She'd forgiven, not for them, but for herself. Dylan's apology echoed, faint but real, a sliver of hope that he might claw his way out of the mess he'd made. Margaret's fate was his burden now. Emma traced the locket's engraving, whispering, "I chose me, Dad. Henry, be proud." A construction site down the road buzzed with life, a now hiring sign glinting in the dusk. She smiled, imagining Dylan there, hammer in hand. Maybe, maybe not. It wasn't her fight anymore. One last letter surfaced as she unpacked, a note from Henry slipped into the tin's lining. "If Dylan's not mine, I still loved him. Blood's not everything. M." The words hung heavy, a final twist. Had Henry stayed for a son who wasn't his, or a lie he couldn't face? Emma tucked it away, the answer beyond her reach. She was free to build, to heal, to live. Wow, folks, what a ride. Did Dylan's apology move you, or is it too late? Was Emma's hospital gift strength or weakness? And that last letter from Henry, what's your take on his choice? Spill your thoughts below. I'm reading every comment. Subscribe now. Let's hit 1,000 subscribers and keep these echoes alive.